Experience the kinetic energy of a life in constant motion, where every choice creates a ripple that changes the world forever. We capture the heat of the moment through our unique 3D cinematic lens. Click subscribe now and be part of the energy that defines our digital world.
The promotion letter sat on my desk for exactly 4 hours before my manager called me into his office and asked me to hand it back. 4 hours. I remember because I'd taken a photo of it on my phone at 9:14 inches the morning. My daughter called me on my lunch break. I told her the news. She screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. And then at 1:22 inches the afternoon, my manager closed his office door, slid a sheet of paper across his desk, and said the words I still hear sometimes when the house is quiet. "We're restructuring the leadership pipeline. The VP role is being eliminated. I'm sorry, Marcus." I nodded. I said I understood. I walked back to my desk, picked up my coffee, and stared at the parking lot for a long time. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't forward my resume to anyone that night. What I did was open my email, find the original offer letter from 22 years ago, and start reading. Let me back up. My name is Marcus. I spent 22 years as a senior systems architect at a mid-sized logistics company in Ohio. Not a flashy job. Not the kind of thing you explain at dinner parties without watching people's eyes glaze over, but it mattered. The software infrastructure I built moved freight across 14 states. Hospitals got their supplies. Grocery chains got their inventory replenished. When my systems ran clean, nobody noticed. That's how you know they're working. I joined the company in my early 30s. My wife Karen had just found out she was pregnant with our son Daniel. We'd moved from Pittsburgh for the opportunity, bought a house with a yard, the whole thing. My manager at the time was a straight-shooting operations director named Gene who believed in handshakes and keeping your word. Gene retired 11 years in. After Gene, things changed. The new leadership structure brought in a regional VP named Clive. I want to be careful here, because this story is about what happened, not about bitterness. But I'll say this. Clive was the kind of manager who took credit for outcomes and assigned blame for failures. He was polished in meetings and slippery in writing. He called himself a culture architect, which told you most of what you needed to know. For the first 5 years under Clive, I kept my head down. I upgraded the routing algorithm 3 times. I led the migration of our legacy dispatch system to a new platform without a single hour of downtime. I documented everything, every decision, every trade-off, every conversation, where I was told to do something I didn't agree with, and did it anyway, because that's what you do when you're a professional. When the company announced a new VP of infrastructure role 2 years ago, Gene, now retired, called me personally. "Marcus," he said, "that job is yours if you want it. You built half of what they're running on." He wasn't wrong. The role would have been a 40% salary increase, equity participation, and a seat at the executive table. More importantly, it would have meant my work was finally acknowledged for what it was. I applied. I went through 6 rounds of interviews. I gave a 3-hour technical presentation to the board. The feedback was unanimously positive. The offer letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, and 4 hours later, it was gone. The explanation I got from Clive was thin. Restructuring the leadership pipeline. When I pressed him professionally, calmly he said the role had been repurposed into a committee function. 3 people would share the responsibilities at their current salary levels. One of those 3 people was Clive's former colleague from his previous company, a man who had been with us for 14 months and had never once touched our core infrastructure. I went home that evening and told Karen what happened. She listened. She's good at that. When I finished, she asked me one question. "Did you read your original contract recently?" I hadn't. Not in years, but Karen had. Because 3 weeks before my interview process started, I'd mentioned to her that I was thinking about applying, and she'd pulled out the folder where we keep important documents, the same folder that has Daniel's birth certificate and the deed to our house, and she'd read my employment agreement while I was in the shower. One night, she'd flagged one paragraph. I'd skimmed it, said interesting, and promptly forgotten about it. That night, after dinner, I found the folder. I read the paragraph Karen had flagged. Then I read it again. Then I sat down on the edge of our bed and was quiet for a while. Here is what that paragraph said, in plain terms. When I was hired, the company was desperate. Their previous systems architect had left without documentation, and they were facing a genuine operational crisis. Gene, to his credit, knew what he was getting in me, and he negotiated accordingly. My original contract contained a clause tucked into Appendix B, 4 pages in, the kind of place most people never look, that read as follows. In the event that the employee is passed over for a promotional role for which they are the primary internal candidate and for which they have received a formal written offer, The company shall provide compensation equal to 36 months of the employee's current base salary, payable within 60 days, unless the employee voluntarily declines the role in writing. 36 months. I had not declined the role in writing. The role had been taken back. The offer letter existed. My current base salary was not small. I did the math 3 times on a yellow notepad. The number was the same each time. I called my brother-in-law, who was a contract attorney in Cleveland. I told him what happened. I read him the clause over the phone. There was a long silence. "Marcus," he said, "do you still have the written offer letter?" I told him I had a photograph of it on my phone, time-stamped. Another silence. "Don't do anything yet," he said. "Let me make some calls." My brother-in-law, I'll call him Raymond, spent 2 weeks reviewing the contract, confirming the clause was enforceable, and consulting with an employment attorney colleague of his who specialized in executive compensation disputes. The conclusion was the same across the board. The clause was valid, the trigger conditions had been met, and the company had 60 days to pay once formally notified. There was one more thing Raymond told me that I hadn't considered. "Marcus, that clause was written in 2002. The company has almost certainly never audited it. My guess is nobody in current leadership even knows it exists." He was right. Gene had written it into my contract personally, by hand, based on a conversation the two of us had had about what it would take to get me to move my family across the state. Gene had put it there because he was a man who kept his word, and he wanted to make sure the company would too, even after he was gone. Gene had known, 11 years before he retired, that not everyone who came after him would be Gene. I picked up the phone and called him. He answered on the second ring. I could hear a baseball game in the background. He was 81 years old and sharp as he'd ever been. "I was wondering when you'd find that," he said. "I want to pause here and tell you something about what this period felt like, because I think it matters. I was not happy. I want to be honest about that. The offer letter had represented something more than money. It was the acknowledgement of 22 years of work done right, done quietly, done without complaint. When it was pulled back, what I felt wasn't just financial disappointment. It was the particular exhaustion of realizing that the institution you gave your best years to had been watching you the whole time and simply decided your best wasn't worth the title. My son Daniel was finishing his second year of college. His sister Emma, our youngest, had just been accepted to a nursing program. Karen had been managing a part-time schedule for 2 years to support both kids through their transitions. Our financial plan had assumed my promotion would close a gap we'd been carefully managing. I was 54 years old. I was not in a position to start over somewhere new and wait another decade for a seat at the table. So when Raymond confirmed that the clause was enforceable, what I felt was not triumph. It was something quieter. It was the feeling of realizing that Gene, 11 years gone from that building, watching baseball in his living room at 81, had looked out for me better than the company had. Raymond sent the formal notification on a Thursday afternoon. It was a single-page letter, precise and polite, citing the clause, the triggering conditions, the documented offer letter, and the 60-day payment window. It was addressed to the company's legal department, copied to HR and the CFO. I was in a staff meeting when it arrived. I didn't say anything. I sat through the agenda, answered my questions about the Q3 routing optimization, and drove home. The call from Clive came the next morning. "Marcus, I need you to come in early today. There's something we need to discuss." I said I'd be there at 8. The meeting room was full. Clive, the HR director, a woman I'd never met who turned out to be outside legal counsel, and the CFO, a man named Phil who had never once spoken to me directly in 4 years of employment despite running a company that depended on infrastructure I maintained. Phil looked like he hadn't slept. Outside counsel, her name was Patricia, had a copy of my contract open on the table. She looked up when I sat down. "Mr. Marcus," she said, "I want to make sure we're aligned on what this clause means and how it applies." "I think we're aligned," I said. Clive leaned forward. "Marcus, there may have been a miscommunication about the role. We'd like to discuss reinstatement of the VP offer with some revised." The 60-day window started when Raymond's letter was received, I said. "I'm not here to renegotiate. I'm here because you asked me to come in." Patricia looked at Phil. Phil looked at his hands. "The clause is valid," Patricia said. "Not to me. To Phil. I've reviewed it. It was properly executed in the original agreement, and the trigger conditions are documented." The room was quiet for a long moment. Phil cleared his throat. "What do you want, Marcus?" I had thought about this question for 2 weeks. Karen and I had talked about it over dinner, during walks around the neighborhood, once very quietly after the kids were asleep. "What I wanted," I said, "was the promotion I earned. That's gone. So now what I want is what the contract says I'm owed. Paid within 60 days. After that, I'll continue in my current role under a revised agreement, or I'll resign. Your choice. I want to tell you about the next 57 days, because a lot happened. The first thing that happened was nothing. Silence from legal, silence from HR, silence from Clive. I came to work, did my job, and waited. On day 19, a system error flagged a critical vulnerability in the dispatch routing layer, the part of the infrastructure I had built in 2009 and updated 4 times since. It was subtle, a conflict in the load balancing logic that would cause the system to misroute high-priority freight under peak load conditions. The kind of thing that wouldn't show up in routine monitoring. The kind of thing I would normally catch in my weekly review and fix in an afternoon. I flagged the vulnerability in writing to my direct supervisor, documented it in our internal ticketing system, and noted in the ticket that resolution would require architectural-level access, which I currently held. I did not fix it. I want to be precise about this. I did not sabotage anything. I did not delete files. I did not introduce the problem. I found a problem that existed, reported it through the proper channels, and waited to be assigned to fix it as part of my normal workflow. When 2 weeks passed and no assignment came because Clive had been quietly telling my supervisor that it was under review, the vulnerability sat there. Day 34, peak shipping season hit. The misrouting began at 2:17 inches the morning on a Wednesday. By 6 a.m., 63 freight shipments were at the wrong distribution centers. 4 hospital supply chains were flagging delays. 2 grocery partners had escalated to their account managers. I was asleep. I got the call at 6:42 from my supervisor. "Marcus, we need you on this now." "Has the ticket been assigned to me?" I asked. A pause. "What?" "The vulnerability ticket I filed 19 days ago. Has it been formally assigned to me for resolution?" Another pause. Longer. "I'll call you back," he said. He called back in 8 minutes. "It's assigned. Please get on." I had the routing issue resolved in 4 hours. The shipment backlog cleared by end of day. No supply chain failures reached the end customer level. That evening, Phil called me directly. First time he'd ever dialed my number. "Marcus," he said, "your payment is processing. You'll have confirmation by end of week." I thanked him and hung up. The payment arrived on day 51. I was at Daniel's baseball game. He plays in a rec league on weeknights. Nothing serious, just something he loves, when my phone buzzed with the deposit confirmation. I looked at the number. I looked at the field where my son was laughing about something with his teammates. I put my phone in my pocket. After the game, Daniel asked me if I wanted to get burgers. We sat in a diner for 2 hours and talked about his classes, his plans, a girl he'd met in his engineering program who he was clearly trying not to sound too excited about. I told him she sounded great. He said she was, kind of too casually. I didn't tell him about the payment until we were in the parking lot. He stopped walking. "Dad," he said, "are you serious?" "The clause was valid," I said. "Gene wrote it." Turns out he was still looking out for me. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I've thought about since. "You never even seemed that angry," he said. "I wasn't angry," I said. "I was patient." I gave the company my 30-day resignation notice the following Monday. What happened next I did not entirely expect. Clive was out within 2 weeks. I don't know the full story, and it's not mine to tell. What I know is that the CFO Phil and the board had a series of conversations following the routing incident, the payment, and a review of the infrastructure documentation, all of which I had kept current, detailed, and stored in our internal system. What they found, I imagine, was that the architecture holding their logistics network together had one author, and that author was leaving. Phil called me on the last week of my notice period. "We'd like to discuss a consulting arrangement," he said. "Project-based. Your terms." I told him I'd think about it. I talked to Karen that night. Emma was home for the weekend, and the 4 of us had dinner together, the kind of meal where everyone lingers at the table because nobody wants to be the first one to go do something else. After the kids cleared the dishes, Karen and I sat with our coffee and she asked me what I was thinking. "I think I want to consult," I said, "but I want it to be real work, not babysitting what I built, actual architectural decisions." "Then say that," she said. I called Phil the next morning and said that. He agreed to everything. The consulting contract I signed 4 months later is the best professional arrangement I've ever had. I work 20 hours a week, from wherever I choose. I set my own project timelines. I have a clear scope, a clear deliverable structure, and a rate that reflects what the work is actually worth, not what a salary band said it was worth. The man who got the restructured VP committee role, Clive's friend from his previous company, lasted 8 months before quietly returning to a technical role. The committee structure dissolved. The position was eventually posted externally. Gene called me when he heard. I don't know how he heard. The man has a network that baffles me. You never raised your voice, he said. Didn't need to, I told him. He laughed. No, you didn't. That's why I wrote that clause. I want to end with something I've been sitting with since all of this happened, because I've been thinking about what the real lesson is. It's not about the money. I want to be clear about that, even though the number was significant and it mattered for our family. The lesson is about documentation. Every decision I flagged, every conversation I memorialized in email, every vulnerability I reported in writing before it became a crisis, every update to every system I built, logged under my name and timestamped. I didn't do any of that because I was planning something. I did it because that's what good work looks like. You document your decisions so that the next person can understand them. You flag problems through proper channels so they get fixed the right way. You keep your agreements, and you read the agreements kept with you. Gene understood something that a lot of executives don't. The people who actually keep systems running are not replaceable on short notice. You can put whoever you want in the VP chair, but if the person who built the architecture walks out the door without a succession plan, without documentation, without a transition, the system doesn't care about your org chart. It just starts failing. The routing vulnerability wasn't a threat. It wasn't leverage. It was a real problem that existed, that I found, that I reported, and that I resolved when I was properly tasked to resolve it. Everything I did was by the book. The book just happened to be one that people who treat employees as interchangeable had stopped reading. 22 years. I gave this company 22 years of careful, documented, unglamorous work. I trained people who got promotions. I didn't. I fixed crises at 2 a.m. that were never mentioned in a board meeting. I built infrastructure that other people put their names on. And at the end of it, what protected me wasn't my resume. It wasn't my LinkedIn profile or my industry contacts or my ability to interview well. It was a paragraph in an old contract that a man named Gene wrote by hand because he believed in keeping his word. Read your contracts. Keep your documentation. Do your work like someone is watching, because someday you'll need the record. And if you ever have a Gene in your corner, someone who believed in you before you had the titles to prove they were right, call them. Tell them you're grateful. I do it every few months. He still answers on the second ring.